Beneath the endless sands of Egypt lies a civilization that refuses to surrender all its secrets. The Great Pyramids stand as silent sentinels to a knowledge we have yet to fully comprehend. Temples carved with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Artifacts that hint at technologies we assumed were centuries away from being discovered. Ancient Egypt was not merely a civilization of pharaohs and slaves building monuments to the gods. It was something far more complex, far more sophisticated, and perhaps far more advanced than we have ever given it credit for. This is not a story of primitive people stumbling through history. This is the story of master engineers, brilliant architects, visionary leaders, and a culture whose achievements seem to defy the limitations of their time. As we peel back the layers of sand and centuries, we find ourselves confronting uncomfortable questions about what we thought we knew about human history. Were the ancient Egyptians merely lucky beneficiaries of trial and error, or did they possess knowledge that has been lost to the ages? Did they understand principles of physics, astronomy, and engineering that we are only now rediscovering? The deeper we dig, the more the answers elude us, replaced instead by even more profound mysteries. Welcome to an exploration of ancient Egypt like no other, where every discovery challenges our assumptions, and every artifact tells a story that historians are still struggling to fully understand. The wooden bird sits behind glass in the Cairo Museum, largely ignored by the thousands of tourists who pass it each day in favor of more glamorous golden treasures and ornate sarcophagi. Yet this simple carved object, discovered in 1898 in a tomb at Saqqara, represents one of the most controversial artifacts in all of Egyptian archaeology. Officially classified as a bird figurine, this small wooden object has sparked decades of heated debate among researchers, engineers, and historians who see something far more intriguing than a child's toy or religious symbol. The artifact, which has come to be known as the Saqqara bird, dates back to approximately 200 BCE, placing it firmly in the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than a carved representation of a bird, perhaps a falcon or some other species sacred to the ancient Egyptians. But look closer, and the details begin to tell a very different story. The Saqqara bird possesses features that are distinctly unusual for a bird representation. Its wings are not positioned as one would expect on a living creature. Instead, they are straight and flat, angled downward in a configuration that ornithologists confirm would be impossible for actual bird flight. The tail is vertical rather than horizontal, another departure from natural avian anatomy. The nose is distinctly pointed, almost like a fuselage. When aeronautical engineers have examined this object, several have noted with surprise that its proportions and design share remarkable similarities with modern monoplane gliders. The weight distribution, the wing shape, the overall aerodynamic profile, all of these elements suggest something that was designed not to represent a bird, but to fly like an aircraft. Some researchers have gone so far as to create scale models based on the exact specifications of the Saqqara bird, and the results have been startling. These replicas, when given a slight push or thrown gently, have demonstrated genuine gliding capabilities, remaining airborne for impressive distances and demonstrating stable flight characteristics. The mainstream archaeological community has largely dismissed the idea that this artifact could represent ancient knowledge of aviation principles. They point out that many cultures created objects that accidentally possess aerodynamic properties without understanding the principles behind them. They argue that the Saqqara bird is simply a weather vane, a toy, or a religious object, and that any resemblance to a modern aircraft is purely coincidental. But this explanation struggles to account for some of the more peculiar details of the object's construction. The wood has been carefully shaped and balanced. The wings show evidence of sophisticated carving techniques that would have required significant skill and planning. This was not a crude approximation or a quickly made trinket. Someone invested considerable time and effort into creating this object with very specific proportions and features. Why would an ancient craftsman go to such lengths to create a bird that looks so unlike any actual bird, unless they were working from a different template altogether? The discovery of the Saqqara bird opened a door to uncomfortable questions about technological knowledge in the ancient world. We have been taught to view human progress as a steady, linear climb from primitive ignorance to modern sophistication. The idea that ancient peoples might have understood principles of aerodynamics thousands of years before the Wright brothers challenges this comfortable narrative. Yet the evidence keeps accumulating. The Saqqara bird is not an isolated anomaly. Throughout ancient cultures, we find hints and suggestions of knowledge that seems out of place, out of time, and out of step with our understanding of how civilizations develop. The ancient Egyptians were master observers of the natural world. Their understanding of astronomy allowed them to create calendars of remarkable accuracy. Their knowledge of mathematics enabled them to construct buildings that have stood for millennia. Their grasp of engineering allowed them to move and position massive stone blocks with a precision that modern construction crews would struggle to match. Is it really so impossible to imagine that these same people might have observed birds in flight and understood the principles that kept them airborne? Some researchers have suggested that the ancient Egyptians might have developed rudimentary gliders or kites, testing the principles of flight on a small scale without ever developing powered aviation. This would explain the Saqqara bird's design without requiring us to believe in anachronistic technology. Ancient texts do contain references to flying objects and soaring through the air, though these are typically dismissed as mythology or metaphor. But what if some of these accounts were based on actual experimentation and observation? What if the ancient Egyptians were testing the boundaries of what was possible with the materials and knowledge available to them, pushing toward innovations that were ultimately lost when their civilization fell into decline? The Saqqara bird remains a mystery, a small wooden object that refuses to fit neatly into our categories and classifications. It is too sophisticated to dismiss entirely, yet too anomalous to embrace without overturning much of what we think we know about ancient technological development. And so it sits in its case, waiting for future researchers to bring new tools and new perspectives to this ancient puzzle. Moving beyond controversial artifacts, we enter the realm of documented history, where the evidence is more substantial, but the stories no less extraordinary. Ancient Egypt was a civilization of rigid hierarchies and established traditions, a society where pharaohs were considered living gods and the royal succession typically passed from father to son. Yet within this conservative framework emerged one of history's most remarkable rulers, a woman who would not only claim the throne, but would become one of Egypt's most successful and innovative pharaohs. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her story is one of political brilliance, architectural vision, and an ultimately futile battle against those who sought to erase her from history. Hatshepsut came to power during the 18th dynasty, a period of great prosperity and expansion for Egypt. She was not born to rule. As a woman in a society that reserved the highest positions of power for men, she faced obstacles that no male heir would encounter. Yet through a combination of political acumen, religious legitimation, and sheer determination, she managed to claim the throne and hold it for more than 2 decades, presiding over one of the most peaceful and prosperous periods in Egyptian history. The circumstances of her rise to power were complex. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, a successful pharaoh who had expanded Egypt's borders and strengthened its economy. When her father died, the throne passed to her half-brother and husband, Thutmose II, as was customary in royal marriages designed to keep power within the family bloodline. Hatshepsut became queen, the great royal wife, a position of significant influence but not ultimate authority. However, Thutmose II was a weak ruler and possibly in poor health. The marriage produced only a daughter, which created complications for the succession. Thutmose II had a son, Thutmose III, by a minor wife, and this boy was designated as the heir. When Thutmose II died after a relatively brief reign, his son was still a child, far too young to rule effectively. In such situations, it was customary for a regent to govern until the child pharaoh came of age. Hatshepsut, as the chief royal widow and aunt to the young king, assumed this role, but she would not remain merely a regent for long. Within a few years of assuming the regency, Hatshepsut made the extraordinary decision to declare herself pharaoh. This was not a coup in the traditional sense, achieved through military force or violent overthrow. Instead, Hatshepsut employed a sophisticated propaganda campaign, religious justification, and political maneuvering to legitimize her claim to the throne. She declared that she was the chosen successor of her father, that the god Amun himself had designated her as pharaoh even before her birth, and that her rule was divinely ordained. To reinforce this claim, she commissioned artwork and inscriptions that depicted her as a male pharaoh, complete with the traditional false beard and male regalia. In some representations, she was shown with a male body, performing the traditional rituals and duties of kingship. This was not an attempt to hide her gender so much as a symbolic statement that she possessed the divine authority of a male ruler, that she embodied the office of pharaoh regardless of her physical sex. The strategy was remarkably successful. Hatshepsut secured the support of key officials and priests, most notably Senenmut, her chief steward and possibly her lover, who became one of the most powerful men in Egypt during her reign. She maintained stability within the government, continued the religious traditions that legitimized pharaonic authority, and embarked on an ambitious program of building and trade that brought unprecedented wealth to Egypt. Unlike many pharaohs who built their reputations on military conquest, Hatshepsut focused primarily on economic development and architectural achievement. She organized a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, a wealthy trading partner whose exact location remains debated but was likely somewhere along the Red Sea coast of East Africa. This expedition brought back exotic goods including myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and live animals, all of which were depicted in detailed reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. The temple at Deir el-Bahari stands as perhaps Hatshepsut's greatest achievement and one of the most architecturally innovative structures of ancient Egypt. Built into a cliff face in a natural amphitheater on the west bank of the Nile, the temple is a masterpiece of integration between architecture and landscape. A series of colonnaded terraces rise in stages toward the cliff, connected by long ramps and adorned with statues, sphinxes, and detailed reliefs depicting the major achievements of Hatshepsut's reign. The design was revolutionary for its time, departing from the traditional temple layouts to create something that was both monumentally impressive and harmoniously integrated with the natural environment. The temple served as both a mortuary temple where offerings could be made to ensure Hatshepsut's continued existence in the afterlife, and as a testament to her piety and her close relationship with the gods, particularly Amen. The reliefs inside tell the story of her divine birth, showing how Amen took the form of her father Thutmose I to conceive her, thus establishing her divine right to rule. For more than 20 years, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt with apparent success. The country was prosperous, peaceful, and stable. Trade flourished, building projects employed thousands of workers, and the bureaucracy functioned smoothly under her administration. Young Thutmose II remained nominally a co-ruler, but real power rested firmly in Hatshepsut's hands. She had managed to accomplish what seemed impossible, not merely to rule as a woman in a man's role, but to be accepted and successful in that role by one of history's most tradition-bound civilizations. Yet she must have known that her position was precarious in the long term. No matter how successful her reign, no matter how prosperous Egypt became under her rule, the fact remained that she was a woman occupying a position that tradition and religious belief held should be occupied by a man. When she died, probably in her mid-40s, the throne finally passed fully to Thutmose III, who had spent decades as the junior partner in the co-regency, watching and waiting as his aunt ruled the kingdom that was rightfully his. What happened next has become one of the great acts of historical erasure. Approximately 20 years after Hatshepsut's death, someone ordered a systematic campaign to remove her from the historical record. Her name was chiseled out of inscriptions. Her images were defaced or removed from monuments. Statues of her were smashed and buried. The reliefs showing her divine birth and her achievements were attacked with chisels, her figure carefully removed while leaving the surrounding scenes intact. Cartouches bearing her name were replaced with the names of her father, her husband, or her nephew. It was a deliberate, methodical attempt to erase Hatshepsut from history, to remove any evidence that a woman had successfully ruled as pharaoh. For centuries, this campaign was largely successful. Hatshepsut's name disappeared from the king lists. Her monuments were attributed to other rulers. The memory of her reign faded into obscurity. It was not until modern archaeologists began to decipher hieroglyphics and carefully study the evidence that the truth began to emerge, and Hatshepsut was restored to her rightful place in history. The identity of the person responsible for this erasure has been debated, but most historians point to Thutmose III as the most likely culprit. The timing of the defacement, beginning approximately 20 years after Hatshepsut's death, coincides with the later years of Thutmose III's reign. The question is why. Some have painted Thutmose III as a bitter, vengeful nephew finally taking revenge on the aunt who had stolen his throne, but this explanation is complicated by several factors. Thutmose III waited decades before ordering the erasure, suggesting that this was not an act of immediate passion or resentment. During the years when Hatshepsut lived and ruled, Thutmose III appears to have served loyally as co-regent, even leading military campaigns on behalf of the joint monarchy. After Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III became one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs, expanding the empire to its greatest extent and earning the nickname the Napoleon of Egypt for his strategic brilliance. A man secure in his own achievements would seem to have little reason to obsess over erasing his predecessor. A more nuanced explanation suggests that the erasure was not personal revenge but political calculation. As Thutmose III aged and thought about his own succession, he may have become concerned about the precedent that Hatshepsut's successful reign had established. If one woman could successfully claim the throne and rule as pharaoh, what would prevent another from doing the same, potentially threatening the succession of Thutmose III's own chosen heir? By erasing Hatshepsut from the record, Thutmose III would be eliminating a dangerous precedent, ensuring that future generations would not have a successful female pharaoh to point to as justification for challenging male royal authority. This interpretation casts the erasure not as petty vindictiveness, but as a calculated political move designed to stabilize the succession and protect the traditional order. It is cold, ruthless, and completely in keeping with the pragmatic politics of ancient Egypt, where maintaining cosmic order and political stability was considered far more important than individual recognition or historical accuracy. Yet despite these efforts, Hatshepsut could not be completely erased. The sheer scale of her building projects, the number of monuments she created, and the depth of her impact on Egyptian society meant that traces remained. Archaeologists working in the 19th and 20th centuries began to notice patterns, began to see evidence of systematic defacement, began to recognize that someone had been deliberately removed from the historical record. Slowly, painstakingly, they pieced together the evidence, matching inscriptions with architectural features, comparing artistic styles, analyzing the content of damaged reliefs. Hatshepsut emerged from obscurity, her story reclaimed from the deliberate attempt to suppress it. Today, she is recognized as one of the most significant pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, a ruler whose achievements in trade, architecture, and administration matched or exceeded those of her male counterparts. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of Egypt's most visited and admired monuments. Her name is taught in schools around the world. The attempt to erase her failed, though it took thousands of years for that failure to become complete. The story of Hatshepsut raises profound questions about historical memory and how we know what we know about the past. How many other figures have been successfully erased, their stories lost forever because the campaign against their memory was more thorough, or because later archaeologists lacked the tools to recover the evidence? How much of what we consider historical fact is actually the product of selective preservation, political revision, and the accidents of survival? The ancient Egyptians were masters of propaganda and self-presentation, carefully crafting their image for posterity through monuments, inscriptions, and artistic representations. But they were also capable of systematically revising that record when it suited their political purposes. Every historical narrative we construct from ancient evidence is necessarily partial, incomplete, and potentially distorted by the intentions of those who created and preserved that evidence. Hatshepsut's story reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what survived, and that survival is often a political act rather than a neutral process. The mummy of Hatshepsut herself remained unidentified for many years, lost among the many royal mummies that had been moved and reburied in ancient times to protect them from tomb robbers. Several candidates were proposed, but it was not until the 21st century that DNA analysis and careful archaeological detective work finally identified her remains. The mummy that is almost certainly Hatshepsut shows a woman who was overweight and possibly suffering from diabetes, who had bad teeth and died in her 50s, probably from an abscess or cancer. It is a stark reminder that even the most powerful ruler was still subject to the physical vulnerabilities that affected all ancient people, that divine status and political authority could not protect against disease and mortality. The woman who had ruled Egypt as a god-king, who had commanded armies and directed vast building projects, who had challenged the most fundamental assumptions about gender and power in her society, died like any other human, her body subject to decay and her memory dependent on the fragile preservation of physical evidence. Beyond the stories of individual rulers and controversial artifacts, ancient Egypt presents us with broader mysteries of technological capability and engineering knowledge. The structures they built, the objects they created, and the systems they developed suggest a level of sophistication that continues to challenge our understanding of what was possible with ancient tools and techniques. Modern engineers and archaeologists examining Egyptian monuments have repeatedly found themselves confronted with puzzles that have no easy answers, techniques that we cannot fully explain, and achievements that seem to push beyond the boundaries of what should have been possible given the technology available. These mysteries do not necessarily point to lost super-civilizations or ancient aliens, but they do suggest that the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge and capabilities that we have not yet fully understood or appreciated. Each new discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that becomes more complex rather than simpler with every excavation season. Consider the massive stone vats discovered in various temple and industrial sites throughout Egypt. These are not simple pottery vessels or crude containers, but precisely carved receptacles cut from single blocks of the hardest stone, including granite, basalt, and diorite. The craftsmanship required to create these vats is extraordinary. The walls are of uniform thickness, the surfaces are polished to a mirror finish, and the overall symmetry is remarkable. Modern stone workers using diamond-tipped tools and laser measuring devices can recreate these objects, but the process is difficult, time-consuming, and expensive even with contemporary technology. The ancient Egyptians created them using copper tools, stone hammers, and abrasive sand, or at least that is what conventional archaeology tells us were their available technologies. The discrepancy between the apparent simplicity of the tools and the sophistication of the finished products has led some researchers to speculate that the Egyptians must have possessed more advanced techniques than we currently understand. Many of these vats show evidence of having contained substances, with black residues still clinging to the interior surfaces after thousands of years. Chemical analysis of these residues has produced intriguing results. Some contain organic compounds that suggest biological processes were taking place inside the vats. Others show evidence of mineral content that does not match the local geology, indicating that exotic materials were being processed or stored. A few researchers have proposed that these vats were used for industrial chemical processes, possibly related to metallurgy, pigment production, or even early battery technology, though this last suggestion remains highly speculative and controversial. What is clear is that these were not simple storage containers, but specialized equipment designed for specific purposes that required precise dimensions and carefully selected materials. The effort invested in creating them suggests that whatever they were used for was considered important enough to justify the enormous labor and skill required for their construction. The precision of ancient Egyptian stonework extends far beyond these mysterious vats. Throughout the temples and monuments of Egypt, we find examples of stone cutting and fitting that seem to exceed what should be possible with the technology we believe they possessed. At the Temple of Karnak, massive granite blocks weighing many tons are fitted together with joints so tight that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. The surfaces are not just approximately flat but precisely planar, with deviations measured in fractions of a millimeter across spans of several meters. The corners are not just roughly square but exact right angles, maintained consistently across the entire structure. Modern construction rarely achieves this level of precision except in the most critical applications, and then only with laser levels, computer-aided design, and sophisticated machining. How did the ancient Egyptians manage it with copper chisels and string? Various theories have been proposed to explain these achievements. Some researchers argue for the existence of lost techniques, methods of stoneworking that were highly effective but have not survived in the archaeological record because they involved perishable materials or were closely guarded secrets of specialized craftsmen. Others point to the role of intensive labor and unlimited time, suggesting that what seems impossible to us was merely difficult for the Egyptians, who could afford to have teams of skilled workers spending years on a single block if necessary to achieve the desired result. Still others propose more controversial ideas, including the use of tools made from meteoritic iron, acoustic levitation devices, or even assistance from advanced civilizations that have left no other trace. The mainstream archaeological community generally favors explanations based on known materials and techniques, but the gap between what these methods should produce and what we actually observe in Egyptian monuments continues to generate debate. Recent discoveries have added new dimensions to these mysteries. The detection of the so-called Big Void inside the Great Pyramid of Giza represents one of the most significant findings in pyramid research in decades. Using muon tomography, a technique borrowed from particle physics, researchers have been able to peer inside the massive stone structure without drilling or excavation. Muons are subatomic particles created when cosmic rays strike the Earth's atmosphere. They rain down constantly and can penetrate solid rock, but they are absorbed more by dense material than by empty space. By placing detectors inside the pyramid and measuring the rate at which muons arrive from different directions, scientists can create a kind of X-ray image of the structure, revealing the presence of chambers and voids. This technique revealed a previously unknown space deep within the pyramid, above the Grand Gallery and comparable in size to the pyramid's other major chambers. The void appears to be approximately 100 feet long and has a cross-section that suggests it may be a corridor or possibly a chamber. The discovery of this void raises tantalizing questions. The Great Pyramid is the most studied ancient structure on Earth, measured, mapped, and analyzed by countless researchers over centuries. The idea that it could still contain major unexplored spaces challenges our assumption that we have comprehensively understood its architecture. What is this void for? Why was it built? What might it contain? The Egyptian authorities have been understandably cautious about authorizing invasive investigation. The pyramid is an irreplaceable cultural treasure, and drilling into it or attempting to break through to the void risks causing damage that could never be repaired. But the existence of this unknown space has reignited speculation about hidden chambers, undiscovered burial chambers, or even libraries of lost knowledge. More conservative interpretations suggest that the void may be a structural feature, a relieving chamber designed to distribute weight away from vulnerable sections of the pyramid, or possibly just an architectural quirk without special significance. Until the void can be directly examined, we are left with speculation based on indirect measurements, one more mystery in a structure that has fascinated humanity for millennia. The Great Pyramid itself represents perhaps the ultimate expression of ancient Egyptian engineering prowess. Built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu during the 4th dynasty, around 2570 BCE, the pyramid originally stood at 146 meters tall, making it the tallest human-made structure in the world for more than 3,800 years. It consists of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with individual blocks weighing anywhere from 2 to 70 tons. The precision of its construction is remarkable. The base forms an almost perfect square, with sides of approximately 230 meters that vary by less than 2 centimeters from perfect equality. The angles of the sides are accurate to within a small fraction of a degree. The structure is aligned almost perfectly with true north, more accurately than many modern buildings. All of this was achieved without steel tools, without the wheel for heavy transport, without pulleys or cranes as we understand them, and without any of the survey instruments or measuring devices that modern engineering takes for granted. Conventional archaeology explains the construction of the Great Pyramid through a combination of massive labor forces, simple machines like levers and sledges, and clever engineering solutions like ramps and counterweights. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the pyramid's construction, reported that it took 100,000 men 20 years to build, though how accurate these numbers are is impossible to verify. Modern calculations suggest that moving and placing 2.3 million blocks in 20 years would require setting a block every 2 to 3 minutes, working continuously day and night, an impressive rate even with a large workforce. Various ramp designs have been proposed to explain how the blocks were raised to the upper levels of the pyramid. Straight ramps would need to be impossibly long to maintain a practical angle of incline. Spiral ramps wrapping around the pyramid face problems with corners and with accessing the pyramid's faces for the precise placement of casing stones. Internal ramps solve some problems but create others, particularly regarding the amount of material needed and the difficulty of maneuvering large blocks in confined spaces. No consensus exists on exactly how the construction was accomplished, only general agreement that it must have involved ramps of some kind, combined with enormous amounts of skilled and unskilled labor. Alternative theories about the pyramid's construction range from the plausible to the outlandish. Some researchers have proposed that the blocks were not solid stone but a form of ancient concrete, cast in place rather than transported from distant quarries. This theory points to the presence of organic fibers and air bubbles in some blocks as evidence of casting, though critics note that these features can also result from natural geological processes. Others have suggested that the builders used water-filled locks like canal systems to float blocks into position, or that they employed sophisticated wooden machines that have left no trace in the archaeological record. At the extreme fringe, theories invoke levitation through sound vibrations, advanced technology from lost civilizations, or even extraterrestrial assistance. While these exotic explanations make for entertaining speculation, they suffer from a complete lack of supporting evidence and fail to explain why such advanced technology would be used exclusively for building tombs, while leaving no trace in any other aspect of Egyptian culture or technology. What is often overlooked in debates about how the pyramid was built is the question of the knowledge systems that made its construction possible. Building the Great Pyramid required more than just muscle power and simple tools. It required sophisticated mathematical knowledge to calculate angles, volumes, and proportions. It required an understanding of astronomy to achieve the precise alignment with the cardinal directions. It required organizational skills to coordinate the work of thousands of laborers, ensuring they were fed, housed, and directed efficiently. It required engineering knowledge to design a structure that would remain stable under its own enormous weight. It required quality control systems to ensure that the millions of blocks were shaped and placed with sufficient accuracy. And it required some form of record-keeping and written communication to preserve and transmit this knowledge among the various specialists involved in the project. The pyramid is not just a pile of stones, but the physical manifestation of an extensive body of theoretical and practical knowledge, much of which was never written down and has been lost to history. Recent archaeological work at the sites where pyramid workers lived and worked has provided new insights into how these massive projects were organized. The workers were not slaves, as popular imagination often depicts, but skilled laborers who were well fed and provided with medical care. They worked in rotating shifts, probably as a form of labor tax that also served to build national unity and reinforce the pharaoh's divine authority. The logistics of keeping this workforce fed, housed, and supplied with tools were enormous, requiring a sophisticated administrative bureaucracy and a prosperous agricultural economy capable of producing significant food surpluses. The pyramid was not just a construction project, but a massive undertaking that involved a substantial portion of Egypt's economic and human resources, one that could only be contemplated by a wealthy, stable, centralized state. Building the pyramid was as much about demonstrating and exercising state power as it was about creating a tomb for the pharaoh. The interior of the Great Pyramid is as mysterious as its exterior is imposing. The pyramid contains 3 main chambers, connected by passages and galleries that show the same precision in their construction as the external structure. The lowest chamber is cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid and was left unfinished for reasons that remain unclear. Above it, accessed through the ascending passage, is the so-called Queen's Chamber, though it almost certainly had nothing to do with any queen. Higher still is the King's Chamber, containing the granite sarcophagus that presumably once held Khufu's mummy, though no trace of the pharaoh or his burial goods has ever been found. The Grand Gallery, a soaring corbelled passage leading to the King's Chamber, is an architectural marvel, its purpose still debated. The shafts extending from the King's and Queen's chambers toward the exterior of the pyramid were long thought to be ventilation shafts, but their alignment with certain stars has led some researchers to propose astronomical or religious significance. Every feature of the pyramid's interior has been measured, analyzed, and theorized about, yet certainty remains elusive. One of the most intriguing discoveries inside the Great Pyramid involved a small robot explorer sent up one of the shafts from the Queen's Chamber. The shaft is only about 20 centimeters square, far too small for a human to enter, and extends for over 60 meters before reaching a blocking stone. In the year 2000, a robot with a small camera was sent up the shaft and transmitted images of the blocking stone, which appeared to have 2 copper fittings embedded in it. Behind the stone, the camera revealed what appeared to be a small chamber or continuation of the shaft. This discovery sparked enormous excitement. Could there be a hidden chamber beyond this stone? What purpose did the copper fittings serve? In 2002, a team drilled a small hole through the blocking stone and sent a camera through, revealing another blocking stone just beyond the first, with a small space between them. Whatever lies beyond the second blocking stone remains unknown, another mystery within the most mysterious building ever constructed. The sophistication of ancient Egyptian technology was not limited to monumental architecture. In temples and tombs throughout Egypt, we find evidence of mechanical systems, hydraulic engineering, and technical knowledge that seem remarkably advanced for their time. Some statues of gods and pharaohs show evidence of mechanical components, hidden systems that allowed the statues to move or speak, creating the impression of divine animation. The statue of Hatshepsut, for example, shows evidence of internal chambers and channels that may have been part of a hydraulic system allowing the statue's head or arms to move. Priests could operate these systems from concealed locations, creating miraculous effects that reinforced religious belief and priestly authority. While we should not exaggerate the sophistication of these mechanisms, which were probably quite simple by modern standards, their existence demonstrates that the ancient Egyptians understood basic principles of hydraulics, leverage, and mechanical advantage, and were willing to apply these principles in creative ways. The famous water systems at various temple sites show impressive engineering skill. At Karnak, a sacred lake was constructed to maintain a constant water level despite evaporation and seepage, probably using underground channels connected to the Nile. At other sites, wells and channels provided water to ritual baths and pools used in religious ceremonies. The Egyptians understood how to create watertight seals using clay and mortar, how to calculate the flow rates needed to maintain pools, and how to construct channels with the proper gradient to move water where it was needed without pumps. Some researchers have proposed that certain temple chambers may have been flooded deliberately as part of initiation rituals, with candidates for the priesthood required to navigate dark, water-filled passages as a test of courage and faith. While direct evidence for such practices is limited, the waterproofing and drainage systems at some sites seem more elaborate than would be needed for simple washing or drinking water. In the realm of metallurgy, the ancient Egyptians demonstrated skills that continue to impress modern analysts. While they never developed iron working to the extent of later civilizations, they were masters of copper and bronze, producing tools, weapons, and decorative objects of remarkable quality. Some copper artifacts show evidence of work hardening, a technique where repeated hammering increases the strength and hardness of the metal. Egyptian goldsmiths produced jewelry of extraordinary delicacy and beauty, using techniques like granulation, filigree, and cloisonné that require precise control of heat and materials. The gold mask of Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous artifact from ancient Egypt, displays a level of craftsmanship that few modern jewelers could match. The mask's features are rendered with subtle modeling and life-like proportions. The inlaid stones and glass are set with perfect precision. The overall effect is one of breathtaking beauty combined with technical mastery. Chemical analysis of Egyptian pigments and dyes reveals sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, even if the theoretical framework was very different from modern chemistry. Egyptian blue, a vibrant blue pigment used in paintings and decorative objects, was synthesized by heating a mixture of silica, copper compounds, and calcium at temperatures of around 900 degrees Celsius. This was not a naturally occurring mineral but an artificial compound, one of the first synthetic pigments ever created. Producing it required knowledge of the right materials, the correct proportions, and the proper temperature, all of which had to be discovered through experimentation and refined over generations. Other pigments used by Egyptian artists included ground minerals, carbon black from burned organic materials, and various iron oxides providing reds, yellows, and browns. The painters who decorated tomb walls and created the vivid images we still admire today were not just artists but also practical chemists, preparing their own materials and understanding through experience what combinations would produce the desired colors and how to make those colors permanent. The process of mummification itself represents one of ancient Egypt's most sophisticated applications of chemical knowledge. Preserving a human body for eternity required understanding how to prevent decay, which meant removing or desiccating the tissues where bacteria thrive. The classic mummification process involved removing the internal organs, which were preserved separately in canopic jars, then drying the body using natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium chloride found in dry lake beds. The body would be packed in natron for approximately 40 days, long enough for the salt to draw out all moisture. After desiccation, the body would be wrapped in linen bandages, often with amulets and protective inscriptions placed between the layers. The entire process took about 70 days and required skilled practitioners who understood each step and its purpose. The result was a preserved body that in ideal conditions could survive for thousands of years, as the many mummies in museums around the world demonstrate. But mummification was more than just a technical process. It was deeply embedded in Egyptian religious belief about the afterlife and the nature of the soul. The Egyptians believed that a person consisted of several components, including the physical body, the ka or life force, the ba or personality, and the ak or transfigured spirit. For the deceased to live eternally in the afterlife, the body had to be preserved as a home for these spiritual components. The mummification process was accompanied by rituals and spells designed to ensure that all parts of the person were properly prepared for the journey to the afterlife. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on the mummy and on statues of the deceased, was believed to restore the ability to eat, drink, breathe, and speak in the next world. Every step of the process had both a practical and a religious dimension, combining technical knowledge with spiritual meaning in a way that modern secular approaches to death and preservation have completely separated. The study of royal mummies has provided extraordinary insights into the lives and health of ancient Egypt's rulers. Ramesses II, one of Egypt's longest reigning and most famous pharaohs, lived into his 90s, an exceptional age for any era but particularly remarkable for the ancient world. His mummy shows evidence of dental disease, arthritis, and hardening of the arteries, all common conditions of advanced age. He was tall for his time, approximately 5 feet 7 inches, and probably had red or auburn hair, unusual for an Egyptian but consistent with his family line. Ramesses II fathered over 100 children with his many wives and concubines, leaving a genetic legacy that can still be traced in modern Egyptian populations. His reign of 66 years saw massive building projects, military campaigns, and diplomatic achievements. He was the pharaoh of the oppression in the biblical Exodus story according to some interpretations, though this identification remains controversial and unproven. What is certain is that he considered himself Egypt's greatest ruler and commissioned monuments on a scale designed to ensure that posterity would agree with his self-assessment. The mummy of Ramesses II has had its own remarkable journey through time. After his initial burial in the Valley of the Kings, his body was moved multiple times by priests trying to protect it from tomb robbers. It eventually ended up in a cache of royal mummies at Deir el-Bahari, where it was discovered in the late 19th century. The mummy was taken to the Cairo Museum, where it remained until the 1970s when it began to show signs of deterioration from fungal infection. In an unprecedented move, the mummy was flown to Paris for treatment and conservation. Ramesses II, dead for over 3,000 years, was issued a modern Egyptian passport listing his occupation as king, deceased, and was received at the French airport with full military honors appropriate to a head of state. French scientists treated the mummy with gamma radiation to kill the fungal spores, stabilized the remaining tissues, and returned the pharaoh to Egypt, where he continues to rest in the Cairo Museum, one of the most studied human remains in history. Other royal mummies tell grimmer stories. Some show evidence of violence and trauma. The mummy identified as Sekhenetertau, a pharaoh of the 17th dynasty who fought against the Hyksos invaders, bears terrible wounds to the skull from axes and spears, injuries consistent with death in battle. His face is twisted in what appears to be a grimace of agony, suggesting that he died violently and was perhaps not embalmed immediately, allowing rigor mortis to set in before preservation began. Several mummies show evidence of disease, including tuberculosis, malaria, and various parasitic infections that were common in ancient Egypt. The mummy of the boy King Tutankhamun revealed that he suffered from malaria, a club foot, and various genetic abnormalities probably resulting from the inbreeding common in royal families. He was not the robust young warrior sometimes depicted in popular media, but a frail youth with multiple health problems, making his death at around 18 years of age less mysterious than it might otherwise appear. The discovery of collections of severed hands at several Egyptian archaeological sites has revealed a practice that was both gruesome and strategic. Ancient Egyptian military texts describe how soldiers would cut off the right hands of defeated enemies as proof of their kills, bringing these trophies back to be counted so that rewards could be distributed. Several pits containing dozens of these severed hands have been excavated, the bones still bearing cut marks from the weapons that separated them from their owner's arms. This practice served multiple purposes. It provided an accurate body count for military records. It prevented soldiers from claiming credit for kills they had not made, since a hand could only be counted once. And it created a powerful psychological impact, both motivating Egyptian soldiers with the promise of rewards and terrorizing enemies who knew they would be mutilated even in death. War in ancient Egypt was not an abstract political exercise but a brutal, visceral reality where bodies were resources to be exploited and human suffering was a tool of statecraft. Yet alongside this violence, ancient Egyptian civilization showed remarkable sophistication in other areas of life. Recent archaeological work has revealed that the Egyptians were not passive victims of their harsh desert environment but active engineers who transformed the landscape to suit their needs. Analysis of ancient pollen, seeds, and organic remains shows that areas now barren desert once supported extensive gardens, orchards, and agricultural plots. This was not because the climate was significantly different, though some variation did occur over the millennia. Rather, it was because the Egyptians developed sophisticated irrigation systems that brought water from the Nile to areas that would otherwise be too dry for cultivation. They built canals, constructed shaduf water lifting devices, and carefully managed their precious water resources to create oases of green fertility in the desert. Scale of this environmental engineering was enormous, transforming the narrow strip of land along the Nile into one of the most productive agricultural regions of the ancient world. This agricultural productivity was the foundation of all Egyptian civilization. The annual flooding of the Nile deposited rich silt across the fields, naturally fertilizing the soil and renewing its productivity. But the floods had to be managed. Too much water could destroy crops and homes. Too little meant famine. The Egyptians developed a system of nilometers, structures that measured the height of the Nile flood, allowing officials to predict the harvest and adjust taxation accordingly. They built levees and canals to distribute water where it was needed and drain it away where it was excessive. They organized labor for the maintenance of this hydraulic infrastructure, understanding that the entire system would collapse without constant attention. The agricultural surplus produced by this system supported the priests, scribes, soldiers, and craftsmen who created the monuments and artifacts we still marvel at today. Without the farmers working the fields and the engineers managing the water, there would have been no pyramids, no temples, and no golden treasures. Everything the Egyptians achieved rested on the foundation of agricultural productivity, wrested from the desert through knowledge, labor, and sophisticated environmental engineering. The Nile River was more than just a water source for ancient Egypt. It was the lifeblood of the civilization, the divine artery that made existence possible in an otherwise inhospitable landscape. The rhythm of Egyptian life followed the rhythm of the river, with the annual flood cycle dividing the year into 3 seasons. Akhet was the inundation season when the Nile swelled with water from rains falling far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, overflowing its banks and covering the fields with water and nutrient-rich silt. Perit was the growing season when the waters receded and crops were planted in the fertile mud. Shemu was the harvest season when the grain was gathered before the next flood began the cycle again. This predictable pattern allowed the Egyptians to develop one of history's most stable agricultural systems, supporting a large population and generating the surplus wealth that funded monumental construction and supported specialized occupations. Unlike civilizations dependent on unpredictable rainfall, the Egyptians could count on their river to sustain them year after year, century after century. This reliability was both blessing and curse, creating prosperity but also fostering conservatism and resistance to change, since the system that had worked for generations seemed to require preservation rather than innovation. The religious significance of the Nile permeated every aspect of Egyptian culture. The river was personified as the god Hapi, depicted as a pot-bellied man with blue or green skin and pendulous breasts, representing the river's life-giving fertility. Hymns praised the Nile as the creator of all good things, the father of life, the sustainer of Egypt. The annual flood was not seen as a natural phenomenon in the modern sense, but as a divine gift, one that required proper religious observances to ensure its return. If the flood was too low, it was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, possibly resulting from the pharaoh's failure to maintain cosmic order or from insufficient offerings to the gods. The entire religious and political system of Egypt was predicated on the belief that human actions, particularly the pharaoh's performance of rituals and maintenance of temples, directly influenced the natural world. This may seem like superstition to modern minds, but it created a powerful framework for social organization and environmental management, since everyone understood that their collective survival depended on maintaining the systems and practices that pleased the gods and ensured the river's bounty. The cities that grew along the Nile were among the largest and most sophisticated urban centers of the ancient world. Memphis, the capital during much of the Old Kingdom, was a sprawling metropolis with a population that may have reached 100,000 or more, an enormous concentration of people for the time. Thebes, later known as Waset to the Egyptians, became the dominant city during the Middle and New Kingdoms, serving as both political capital and religious center. The temple complexes at Thebes, particularly Karnak and Luxor, grew over centuries into vast architectural landscapes covering hundreds of acres. Karnak alone employed thousands of priests, scribes, and workers, functioning as both religious center and economic institution that owned extensive agricultural lands, managed large herds of cattle, and accumulated tremendous wealth through donations and offerings. Walking through these ruins today, even in their damaged and incomplete state, one can barely comprehend the scale and grandeur they must have possessed when intact, with massive columns soaring overhead, walls covered in brilliantly colored reliefs, gold leaf catching the sunlight, and endless processions of priests performing rituals in a carefully choreographed dance of religious observance. The Egyptian concept of cosmic order, known as Ma'at, was central to their understanding of how the universe functioned. Ma'at was both a goddess and an abstract principle, representing truth, justice, harmony, and balance. Everything from the rising of the sun to the flooding of the Nile to the succession of pharaohs was seen as part of maintaining Ma'at against the constant threat of chaos or isfit. The pharaoh's primary responsibility was to uphold Ma'at, which meant performing religious rituals correctly, dispensing justice fairly, defending Egypt's borders, and maintaining the temples and their priesthoods. This was not merely symbolic. The Egyptians genuinely believed that failure to maintain Ma'at would result in cosmic catastrophe, that the sun might fail to rise, the Nile might not flood, or enemies might overwhelm the land. Every action had cosmic significance, every ritual was essential, and every deviation from proper order was potentially catastrophic. This worldview created a deeply conservative society resistant to change and innovation, but it also generated extraordinary commitment to precision, continuity, and the preservation of knowledge and practices across generations. The priesthood that served Egypt's many gods formed a complex hierarchy with enormous power and influence. At the top were the high priests of the major temples, men who wielded political authority, rivaling that of provincial governors. Below them were various ranks of priests with specialized roles, from those who performed daily rituals of feeding, clothing, and honoring the god statues to those who maintained the temple buildings and managed the institution's economic activities. Priests underwent extensive training, learning to read and write hieroglyphics, memorizing the liturgies and rituals required for different ceremonies, and mastering the astronomical knowledge needed to determine the correct days for festivals and observances. Many priests served part-time, rotating in and out of temple service while maintaining other occupations, though the highest positions required full-time dedication. The priesthood was not necessarily a celibate profession, as in some later religions. Priests could marry, own property, and pursue wealth like any other Egyptians, though they were expected to maintain ritual purity during their periods of temple service, which meant frequent bathing, shaving all body hair, wearing clean linen garments, and abstaining from certain foods and activities. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed legal rights and social status that were remarkable for the ancient world. They could own and inherit property, engage in business transactions, serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, and initiate divorce. Women of the upper classes could become priestesses, with some temples having female clergy who performed rituals and managed sacred properties. The title God's Wife of Amun became extremely powerful during certain periods, with the holder wielding enormous influence and controlling vast temple estates. Queens and royal women could exercise significant political power, either as regents for young kings or as influential advisors to ruling pharaohs. Hatshepsut's successful reign as pharaoh demonstrated that gender was not an absolute barrier to political authority, even if her exceptional case required extraordinary justification and ultimately provoked a backlash. For ordinary women, life was defined by domestic responsibilities, marriage, and childbearing, but within that sphere they exercised considerable autonomy and authority. Women managed household economies, controlled family resources, and made decisions about child rearing and daily life without requiring male permission or oversight. The institution of marriage in ancient Egypt was primarily a practical and economic arrangement rather than a religious sacrament. There were no wedding ceremonies conducted by priests or state officials. A couple became married simply by setting up a household together, though in practice this was usually formalized by contracts specifying property arrangements and the rights of both parties. Divorce was relatively straightforward and could be initiated by either spouse, though the social consequences might differ depending on the circumstances and the status of the individuals involved. Children were highly valued, seen as both economic assets who would support their parents in old age and as essential for ensuring that funerary cults and offerings continued after death. Infant mortality was high, as it was throughout the pre-modern world, and many women died in childbirth. These harsh demographic realities meant that families were often complex, with children from multiple marriages, adopted children, and extended kin networks all living and working together. Education in ancient Egypt was not universal, but was available to those whose families could afford to forego a child's labor and pay for instruction. Schools were typically attached to temples or government offices, where boys and occasionally girls from elite families learned to read and write hieratic script, the cursive form of hieroglyphics used for everyday documents. Students practiced by copying standard texts on pottery shards or limestone flakes called ostraca, which were cheaper than papyrus. The curriculum included mathematics, with a focus on practical problem-solving related to taxation, measurement, and construction. Students learned literature by memorizing classic texts and copying them repeatedly. The goal was not critical thinking or creativity in the modern sense, but mastery of established knowledge and the ability to replicate it accurately. Those who successfully completed this education could pursue careers as scribes, the white-collar workers of ancient Egypt who staffed the vast bureaucracy that managed taxation, legal affairs, temple administration, and government operations. Being a scribe was an honored profession that exempted one from manual labor and provided a comfortable living, making literacy a pathway to social advancement for those talented and fortunate enough to receive an education. The legal system of ancient Egypt was sophisticated and complex, with written law codes, professional judges, and established court procedures. Cases were heard by local councils in villages or by royal courts for more serious matters. Evidence was presented, witnesses were called and sometimes required to swear oaths, and judgments were rendered based on precedent and established principles. Punishments for crimes varied depending on the severity of the offense and the social status of the parties involved. Minor offenses might result in beatings or fines. Serious crimes could lead to mutilation, hard labor, or execution. Tomb robbery was considered particularly heinous because it not only stole property, but also threatened the deceased's ability to survive in the afterlife, and convicted tomb robbers faced brutal punishments, including impalement. The legal system recognized distinctions between social classes, with different penalties applying to nobles versus commoners for the same offense, but there was also a recognition that even the powerful were subject to law and that unjust treatment could be appealed to higher authorities. The Egyptian economy was not based on coined money, which would not be invented until much later, but on a barter system with standardized units of value. The deben, a weight of copper or later silver, served as a standard of value even when actual metal did not change hands. Goods and services were assessed in deben values, and transactions could involve complex exchanges where multiple goods and services were traded until both parties felt they had received equivalent value. The state paid workers in rations of grain, beer, and other commodities rather than money. Tax collection involved assessing the productivity of agricultural lands, the output of workshops, and the catches of fishermen, with taxes paid in goods that were then redistributed to support the government, priesthood, and royal court. This system required extensive record-keeping and a large bureaucracy of scribes to track production, assess taxes, manage storehouses, and ensure that workers received their rations. The famous worker strikes at Deir el-Medina, where the craftsmen building royal tombs stopped work because their grain rations had not been delivered on time, demonstrate that even in ancient Egypt, labor disputes could arise when the economic system failed to fulfill its obligations to workers. The village of Deir el-Medina itself provides an extraordinary window into the lives of ordinary Egyptians, or at least ordinary skilled workers. This community was established to house the craftsmen, artists, and workers who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Because of its isolated location and specialized purpose, the village was particularly well documented, and the dry climate preserved thousands of ostraca bearing everything from official records to personal letters to student exercises. From these fragments, we can reconstruct daily life in remarkable detail. We know about disputes between neighbors over property boundaries. We learn about workers taking days off for various ailments, with one frequently cited excuse being bitten by a scorpion. We read love poetry, shopping lists, and complaints about ration deliveries. We discover that the community had its own court that handled local disputes, that women could bring legal cases, and that workers had the right to sell their labor independently when not engaged in royal projects. The picture that emerges is of a community that was tightly organized and heavily supervised, but also possessed considerable autonomy and a rich social life full of the same concerns, joys, and petty annoyances that characterize human communities in any era. The tombs that these workers constructed in the Valley of the Kings represent some of ancient Egypt's most spectacular achievements. Beginning in the New Kingdom, pharaohs abandoned the pyramid form, which had proven too conspicuous and vulnerable to robbery, in favor of rock-cut tombs hidden in a remote desert valley. These tombs were tunneled deep into the limestone cliffs, with corridors, chambers, and shafts designed to confuse robbers and protect the royal burial. The walls were covered with scenes and texts from funerary literature, particularly the Book of the Dead, the Amjuat, and other guides to the afterlife that provided the deceased pharaoh with the knowledge and spells needed to navigate the dangers of the underworld and achieve eternal life. The quality of the artwork in these tombs is extraordinary, with colors that remain vibrant after thousands of years and details rendered with meticulous care. Artists worked by the light of oil lamps in cramped, stifling conditions, yet they produced masterpieces that still take the breath away. The tomb of Seti I is particularly remarkable, with corridor after corridor of detailed reliefs showing the pharaoh in the presence of various gods, texts covering every available surface, and an astronomical ceiling depicting the constellations as the Egyptians understood them. Despite the secrecy surrounding these tombs and the elaborate measures taken to protect them, almost all were robbed in antiquity, most within a few decades or centuries of the burial. The treasures they contained were simply too tempting, and the economic disruptions of later periods created both opportunity and motivation for tomb robbery. Robbers sometimes included the very workers who had built the tombs and knew their layouts, or guards who were supposed to protect them. Legal records describe the trials of tomb robbers who were captured, tortured to extract confessions, and severely punished, yet the robberies continued. By the time archaeologists began systematically exploring the Valley of the Kings in modern times, they found tomb after tomb that had been ransacked, with mummies torn apart in the search for amulets and jewelry, funerary goods smashed or stolen, and only fragments remaining of the treasures that had once been buried. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter was so sensational precisely because it was the only substantially intact royal tomb ever found in the valley, despite having been partially robbed in antiquity. The treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb have become the public face of ancient Egypt, with the Golden Death Mask in particular serving as an icon recognized worldwide. Yet Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh who died young and achieved little during his brief reign. The wealth buried with him, though spectacular, was probably modest compared to what was interred with more powerful and long-lived pharaohs like Ramesses II or Thutmose III. If a relatively unimportant king was buried with over 5,000 objects including multiple shrines, chariots, furniture, weapons, clothing, jewelry, and ritual objects, all crafted with extraordinary skill and lavishly decorated, what must the tombs of the great pharaohs have contained before they were plundered? The loss to history and to human cultural heritage is incalculable. We can only glimpse the full splendor of ancient Egyptian royal burials through the fortunate survival of this one relatively minor example. The process of preparing a tomb for royal burial was extensive and began as soon as a pharaoh took the throne. Workers would start tunneling into the rock, carefully following plans that specified the number, size, and decoration of chambers. Artists would apply layers of plaster to the walls, sketch out the scenes and texts in red ink, make corrections in black ink, then carve the designs in relief before finally painting them in brilliant colors. Meanwhile, craftsmen throughout Egypt would be at work creating the funerary goods, everything from the nested coffins that would hold the mummy to the shabti figures that would serve as magical servants in the afterlife. The scale of this undertaking was enormous, employing hundreds of specialized workers over many years. If a pharaoh died unexpectedly before the tomb was complete, there would be a scramble to finish enough of it to serve its purpose, which is why some tombs show evidence of hasty completion, with sections left undecorated or roughly finished. The tomb was not just a burial place, but an eternal temple where the deceased pharaoh would be worshipped as a god, requiring proper decoration and equipment for the performance of rituals into perpetuity. The religious texts inscribed on tomb walls reveal a complex understanding of the afterlife involving multiple stages and challenges. The deceased had to pass through gates guarded by demons, navigate lakes of fire, defeat serpents and monsters, and ultimately face judgment before Osiris, the god of the dead. In the famous weighing of the heart ceremony, the deceased's heart was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Maat. If the heart was lighter than the feather, unburdened by sin and wrongdoing, the deceased was welcomed into the afterlife. If the heart was heavier, weighed down by evil deeds, it would be devoured by Ammit, a composite monster, and the person would cease to exist. This was the ultimate terror for ancient Egyptians, not punishment in an afterlife but complete annihilation, the ending of existence. To prevent this fate, tombs included spells and declarations of innocence known as negative confessions, where the deceased denied committing various sins and transgressions. Modern readers of these texts sometimes find themselves serving in question whether simply declaring one's innocence was enough, but the Egyptians believed that words had power, that properly spoken formulas could make things true in the spiritual realm, even if the material reality was different. The democratization of the afterlife over the course of Egyptian history represents a significant religious evolution. In the earliest periods, only the pharaoh was guaranteed eternal life, with his officials and servants hoping to benefit from association with the divine king. Over time, particularly during the Middle Kingdom, the afterlife became accessible to anyone who could afford the proper burial and funerary rituals. This led to the production of standardized funerary texts, most famously the Book of the Dead, which was not actually a single book but a collection of spells that could be selected and customized based on the wealth and preferences of the deceased. Copies of these spells were written on papyrus and placed in the tomb or inscribed on coffins and tomb walls, providing the deceased with the magical knowledge needed to navigate the afterlife successfully. The most elaborate versions included beautiful illustrations showing the deceased interacting with gods, traveling through the underworld, and enjoying the pleasures of the field of reeds, the Egyptian equivalent of paradise. More modest versions might include just a few key spells written in simplified script, but even the poorest Egyptians aspired to some form of proper burial, understanding that the funeral rituals and magic spells were essential for survival after death. This widespread concern with death and the afterlife might seem morbid to modern sensibilities, but it reflected a deeply life-affirming worldview. The Egyptians loved life and wanted it to continue forever. They did not seek escape from existence, but its eternal prolongation. The afterlife was imagined as similar to earthly life but perfected, without pain, sickness, or want. The deceased would be reunited with loved ones, would enjoy feasts and celebrations, would continue their favorite activities, and would live in a state of permanent contentment. To achieve this, the body had to be preserved, the name had to be remembered, and offerings had to be made. This created a powerful incentive for achievement and monument building during life, since being remembered was essential for continued existence after death. A person who died without leaving some trace, whose name was forgotten, would truly cease to exist. Conversely, as long as someone's name was spoken, their tomb visited, or their monument stood, they continued to exist in some form. This belief helps explain the obsessive monument building and the careful preservation of names and titles that characterizes so much of Egyptian culture. The Egyptian understanding of time itself was fundamentally different from modern conceptions. They had no sense of linear historical progress, no expectation that the future would be different from or better than the past. Instead, time was cyclical, with the same patterns repeating endlessly. Each day the sun god Ra battled the forces of chaos and was reborn each morning. Each year the Nile flooded and renewed the land. Each pharaoh was a new incarnation of Horus, maintaining the same cosmic order as his predecessors. History was not a story of development and change, but of continuity and repetition. This worldview fostered extreme conservatism in art, architecture, and social organization. Why change what had worked for centuries or millennia? Innovation was viewed with suspicion as a potential disruption of rather than as improvement or progress. This explains why Egyptian artistic conventions remained remarkably stable over 3,000 years, with the same poses, proportions, and compositional rules being followed generation after generation. When changes did occur, they were often the result of foreign influence, political upheaval, or religious revolution rather than organic artistic evolution. The Amarna period represents the most dramatic break from Egyptian tradition in the civilization's entire history. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who renamed himself Akhenaten, attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion by promoting the worship of the Aten, the sun disk, as the supreme and possibly only god. This represented a radical departure from the traditional polytheism that had defined Egyptian religion for millennia. Akhenaten closed temples to other gods, persecuted their priesthoods, and redirected resources to the worship of the Aten. He moved the capital from Thebes to a new city, Akhenaten, modern Amarna, where he built temples and palaces devoted to his new religion. The art of the Amarna period broke dramatically from convention, showing the royal family in informal domestic scenes, depicting the pharaoh with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and a potbelly, and generally abandoning the idealized formal style that had characterized royal representation for centuries. Some scholars interpret these changes as a move toward realism, while others see them as a new kind of stylization reflecting Akhenaten's unique theology. The reasons for Akhenaten's religious revolution remain debated. Some view it as a genuine spiritual conviction, the vision of a monotheistic or henotheistic faith that anticipated later religions. Others see it as a political move designed to break the power of the priests of Amen, who had accumulated enormous wealth and influence that potentially threatened royal authority. Still others suggest psychological explanations, viewing Akhenaten as mentally unstable or physically abnormal, though the evidence for this is limited and problematic. What is clear is that the changes he imposed were deeply unpopular and did not survive his death. His successor, the young Tutankhamun, was pressured by the traditional priesthood to abandon Amarna and return to Thebes, to reopen the temples of the old gods and to restore the religious status quo. After Akhenaten's death, his memory was deliberately erased, his monuments defaced, and his city abandoned. Later king lists omitted his reign entirely, jumping directly from Amenhotep III to the restoration under Tutankhamun, as if the heretic king had never existed. The Amarna experiment demonstrated that there were limits to pharaonic power, that some traditions were too fundamental to Egyptian identity to be overturned even by a living god. The art recovered from Amarna provides fascinating insights into royal life during this period. Unlike traditional Egyptian art that maintained careful boundaries between divine and human realms, Amarna art shows the royal family in intimate moments, with Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti playing with their daughters, kissing each other, and engaging in casual interactions. The Aten is shown beaming rays down upon them, with each ray ending in a small hand offering the Ankh symbol of life. The overall effect is both strange and charming, showing powerful individuals in moments of domestic tenderness rather than formal ritual. Nefertiti herself, known today primarily through the famous painted bust discovered at Amarna, was an unusually prominent queen who appeared in official art with a frequency and prominence equal to the pharaoh himself. Some scholars have suggested she may have ruled briefly as pharaoh after Akhenaten's death, though the evidence is ambiguous and disputed. What is certain is that she was a powerful and influential figure during one of Egyptian history's most turbulent periods. The abandonment of Amarna after Tutankhamun's return to Thebes created a unique archaeological situation. Unlike most Egyptian cities which were occupied continuously for centuries or millennia, with later construction destroying earlier remains, Amarna was occupied for less than 20 years and then completely abandoned. This created a time capsule preserving a snapshot of Egyptian life in the 14th century BCE. Archaeologists excavating Amarna have found not just temples and palaces, but also ordinary houses, workshops, and even garbage dumps containing the debris of daily life. Clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform script have preserved diplomatic correspondence between Akhenaten and other rulers of the ancient Near East, providing crucial evidence for international relations during this period. Workshop areas have revealed the process of artistic production, with unfinished sculptures showing the stages through which a work progressed from rough block to polished masterpiece. Even the workmen's village has been excavated, showing how ordinary people lived and worked during the Amarna period. This wealth of evidence has made Amarna one of the most intensively studied sites in all of Egypt, a window into a moment when the civilization's normal conservatism broke down and something genuinely new was attempted. Beyond Amarna, our understanding of ancient Egyptian daily life comes from numerous sources including tomb paintings, archaeological excavation of settlement sites, and the thousands of ostraca and papyri preserving everything from business records to personal letters. These sources reveal a society more complex and nuanced than the monumental architecture might suggest. People worried about money, complained about their neighbors, fell in love, raised children, pursued careers, engaged in petty feuds, and generally lived lives that would be recognizable to modern people despite the vast differences in technology and worldview. Love poetry from ancient Egypt expresses sentiments that remain relatable, with young lovers pining for each other, praising the beloved's beauty, and lamenting separation. Medical texts show physicians diagnosing and treating a range of conditions with varying degrees of success, using treatments that combined practical knowledge with magical incantations. Mathematical papyri demonstrate that Egyptian mathematics was highly practical, focused on solving real-world problems related to construction, agriculture, and trade, rather than pursuing abstract theory. Egyptian mathematics was based on a decimal system, but expressed fractions in a unique way that seems cumbersome to modern eyes. Instead of using fractions like 2/3 or 3/4 as we would, Egyptians expressed fractions primarily as sums of unit fractions with 1 as the numerator. So instead of writing 3/4, they would write 1/2 plus 1/4. This system required special tables showing how to decompose various fractions into sums of unit fractions, and mathematical papyri include extensive fraction tables for reference. Despite this apparently awkward notation, Egyptian mathematicians could solve complex problems involving area calculations, volume determinations, and proportion problems. The famous Rhine mathematical papyrus, dating to around 1650 BCE, contains 84 problems with solutions, covering topics from basic arithmetic to geometric calculations needed for pyramid construction. The problems are presented practically, as real-world situations that a scribe might encounter, demonstrating that mathematics was viewed as a tool for solving practical problems rather than an abstract discipline pursued for its own sake. Egyptian astronomy was closely tied to religious belief and practical concerns like maintaining an accurate calendar. The Egyptians recognized various celestial objects and observed their movements carefully. They identified the planets visible to the naked eye, though they did not understand them as planets in the modern sense. They observed and recorded the movements of stars, creating star charts and connecting certain stars with particular gods. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, coincided with the annual Nile flood and was used to mark the beginning of the year. The Egyptians developed a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 extra days added at the end. This calendar was more accurate than the lunar calendars used by many other ancient cultures, though it still fell short of the true solar year by about a quarter day, causing it to drift slowly over centuries. For religious purposes, the Egyptians also maintained a lunar calendar that was periodically adjusted to keep festivals aligned with the appropriate seasons. The need to coordinate these different calendrical systems required astronomical knowledge and mathematical calculation, making astronomy an important part of priestly education. The alignment of various temples and monuments with astronomical phenomena has led to considerable speculation about the depth of Egyptian astronomical knowledge. The Great Pyramid is famously aligned almost perfectly with true north, more accurately than many modern buildings. Various shafts and passages in pyramids align with specific stars or stellar configurations that held religious significance. Some temples are oriented so that sunlight penetrates deep into interior chambers only on specific days of the year, illuminating statues of gods in a dramatic demonstration of the connection between earthly temple and cosmic order. These alignments required careful observation and precise construction, demonstrating sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and engineering. However, we should be cautious about reading too much into these alignments. The Egyptians did not understand the cosmos as modern astronomy describes it. They did not know that the Earth orbits the sun, that stars are distant suns, or that the universe extends billions of light years in all directions. Their cosmology was fundamentally religious, understanding the sky as the body of the goddess Nut stretched across the earth, with the sun traveling across her body during the day and through her body at night to be reborn each morning. Astronomical knowledge was in service of this religious understanding rather than contradicting it. The religious landscape of Egypt was extraordinarily complex, with hundreds of gods and goddesses worshipped in various locations and contexts. Some deities were universal, worshipped throughout Egypt, while others were primarily local, associated with specific cities or regions. Many gods had multiple forms and aspects and could merge with other gods in composite deities like Amun-Ra, combining the hidden power of Amun with the solar authority of Ra. Animals were sacred to particular gods, and certain animal species were kept in temples as living incarnations of divine power. The Apis bull at Memphis was considered the living manifestation of the god Ptah, and when it died, was mummified and buried with honors befitting royalty. Cats were sacred to the goddess Bastet, and hundreds of thousands of mummified cats have been found at sites associated with her worship, offerings from devotees seeking her favor. Ibises were sacred to Thoth, crocodiles to Sobek, and so on through the entire Egyptian pantheon. The modern mind struggles to understand a religious system where the same god could be shown with different animal heads in different contexts, where gods could merge and separate, and where divine power could be simultaneously cosmic and local, abstract and embodied in a specific animal. The religious texts that have survived provide insight into Egyptian theology, though they were never systematized into a single coherent doctrine. Creation myths varied by region, with different gods credited as the creator depending on local tradition. The priests at Heliopolis taught that Atum created himself from the primeval waters and then created other gods through masturbation or spitting. The priests at Memphis taught that Ptah created the world through thought and speech, simply naming things into existence. The priests at Hermopolis taught that creation emerged from 4 pairs of primordial deities representing darkness, hiddenness, infinity, and formlessness. These contradictory accounts were not seen as problematic. Each could be true in its own context, each revealed a different aspect of the divine mystery. The Egyptian mind was comfortable with ambiguity and multiplicity in ways that later monotheistic traditions, with their emphasis on doctrinal consistency and exclusive truth claims, would find difficult to comprehend. Magic and religion were not separate categories in Egyptian thought. The same priests who performed temple rituals also practiced magic, using spells and incantations to achieve practical goals like healing disease, protecting against dangerous animals, or ensuring success in love or business. The boundaries between prayer, ritual, and magical spell were fluid and overlapping. Power resided in knowing the correct words, the secret names of gods and demons, and the proper procedures for compelling spiritual forces to act on one's behalf. This magical worldview permeated every aspect of life. Amulets were worn for protection against various dangers. Spells were recited over food and drink to neutralize poisons. Dreams were interpreted as messages from the gods or the dead, and dream books provided standardized interpretations of common dream symbols. Medicine combined practical treatments with magical spells, and a physician might prescribe both a poultice for a wound and an incantation to drive out the demon causing the injury. This integration of magical and practical approaches would continue in various forms through much of human history, and has only relatively recently been displaced by the modern scientific worldview that sharply distinguishes between natural and supernatural causation. The practice of magic extended into politics and warfare. Before battle, priests would perform rituals to curse the enemy and ensure divine favor for Egyptian arms. Figurines of enemies would be inscribed with curses and then smashed, symbolically destroying the foe. Treaties with foreign powers included lists of gods from both nations who would witness and enforce the agreement, turning diplomacy into a religious act with spiritual consequences for violation. The pharaoh himself was a magical being whose presence and actions maintained cosmic order. When he performed the rituals in the temple, he was not simply honoring the gods but actively sustaining the universe, ensuring that the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and Ma'at would prevail over chaos. This was not metaphor or symbol but literal truth as the Egyptians understood it. The entire civilization rested on the foundational belief that correct performance of rituals by the proper authorities was essential for the continuation of existence itself. This worldview created enormous pressure for continuity and tradition. If the rituals that had sustained the world for thousands of years were changed or abandoned, the consequences could be catastrophic. Innovation in religion was dangerous, which helps explain the extreme reaction against Akhenaten's reforms and the thoroughness with which they were reversed after his death. Yet despite this conservatism, Egyptian religion did evolve over the millennia, with new gods being adopted, old gods rising or falling in prominence, and theological concepts developing and changing. The process was gradual and often unconscious, with changes being incorporated into tradition rather than recognized as innovations. New gods were explained as alternative names or aspects of old gods. New myths were harmonized with existing stories through creative interpretation. The result was a religious system of extraordinary complexity and internal diversity that nonetheless maintained a recognizable continuity over 3,000 years of history. The end of ancient Egyptian civilization was not a sudden collapse but a long, slow decline punctuated by periods of foreign domination and brief revivals. After the glories of the New Kingdom, Egypt entered a period of fragmentation and weakness. The country was invaded by the Nubians from the south, who established their own dynasty ruling Egypt and maintaining many Egyptian traditions. The Assyrians conquered Egypt briefly, followed by a period of native rule under the Saite dynasty, which consciously attempted to revive the glories of earlier periods through deliberate archaism in art and architecture. The Persians conquered Egypt and incorporated it into their empire, governing it as a province but respecting local traditions and maintaining temples. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt from the Persians and was welcomed as a liberator, establishing a new capital at Alexandria that would become one of the great cities of the ancient world. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries, maintaining the forms of pharaonic kingship while actually representing a Greek ruling class governing a native Egyptian population. The Ptolemaic period saw a strange hybrid culture develop, particularly in Alexandria. The city was thoroughly Greek in character, with Greek language, Greek architecture, and Greek customs dominating. The famous Library of Alexandria collected texts from throughout the known world, becoming the greatest center of learning in the ancient Mediterranean. Yet the Ptolemaic kings also presented themselves as pharaohs, building temples in traditional Egyptian style, supporting the native priesthoods and performing the rituals expected of Egyptian rulers. The Rosetta Stone, which would eventually provide the key to deciphering hieroglyphics, was created during the Ptolemaic period and demonstrates this cultural fusion. It contains the same text in three scripts: Greek for the ruling class, Demotic Egyptian for daily business, and hieroglyphics for religious purposes, showing how the different languages and scripts coexisted in this complex society. Native Egyptian culture continued in the temples and among the common people, but power and prestige increasingly belonged to the Greek newcomers. The last Ptolemaic ruler was Cleopatra VII, famous for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and for her dramatic suicide after defeat in the civil wars that marked the end of the Roman Republic. With her death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, governed by a prefect appointed by the emperor. Egypt was treated as the personal property of the emperor, and no senator was allowed to visit without imperial permission. Such was the wealth and strategic importance of the province. Egyptian grain fed the city of Rome, and Egyptian wealth enriched the imperial treasury. Roman rule brought some benefits, including peace and administrative efficiency, but it also meant that Egypt was governed for the benefit of foreigners with little concern for local traditions or the welfare of the native population. The temples continued to function for some centuries under Roman rule, but they were shadows of their former selves, maintained more for their political usefulness in controlling the population than from genuine religious conviction. The coming of Christianity marked the true end of ancient Egyptian religion. The new faith spread rapidly through Egypt, appealing particularly to the native Egyptian population who saw in Christianity's monotheism and its promise of salvation a liberation from both the old gods and the foreign rulers. By the 4th century CE, Christianity was the dominant religion, and the old temples were being closed, defaced, and converted into churches. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis at Philae, a final monument to a writing system and religious tradition that stretched back more than 3,000 years. After that, the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphics was lost. The old gods were forgotten except as demons in Christian demonology, and the monuments became mysterious ruins whose meaning and purpose were no longer understood. The Egypt of the pharaohs became ancient Egypt, a lost civilization whose secrets would remain buried for more than 1,000 years. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt began with Napoleon's invasion in 1798, which brought not just soldiers but also a corps of scholars who studied and documented the monuments they found. The publication of the Description de l'Egypte, a massive multi-volume work describing Egypt's antiquities, sparked European fascination with ancient Egyptian culture. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone, captured from the French by the British and deposited in the British Museum, provided the key that would eventually unlock the hieroglyphic writing system. Jean-François Champollion's successful decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822 opened Egyptian civilization to scholarly study, transforming the monuments from mysterious curiosities into legible historical documents. Throughout the 19th century, European and American excavators descended on Egypt, sometimes conducting systematic archaeology, but often simply looting tombs and temples to fill museums and private collections in the West. Mummies were unwrapped at public events, monuments were dismantled and shipped abroad, and priceless artifacts were treated as curiosities rather than precious evidence of human history. Modern Egyptology has developed more responsible approaches to studying ancient Egypt, though the discipline still grapples with its colonial origins and the ethics of who should own and control access to Egyptian cultural heritage. Excavations are now carefully documented, with every artifact's context recorded and preserved. Conservation has become as important as discovery, with major efforts devoted to protecting monuments from damage by pollution, tourism, and environmental change. New technologies have opened up possibilities that early Egyptologists could never have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar reveals structures still buried beneath the sand. DNA analysis allows us to trace family relationships among royal mummies and understand the genetic diseases they suffered from. Chemical analysis of residues tells us what was stored in ancient containers. Computer modeling allows us to reconstruct damaged monuments virtually and test theories about construction techniques. Each season brings new discoveries and new insights, adding to our understanding of this civilization that continues to fascinate more than 2 millennia after its end. Yet for all we have learned, mysteries remain. The exact methods used to construct the pyramids are still debated. The purpose of certain chambers and features in temples and tombs remains unknown. Texts remain undeciphered or poorly understood. Archaeological sites that have never been excavated may contain evidence that will overturn current theories. The recent discovery of the Big Void in the Great Pyramid demonstrates that even the most studied monument on Earth can still surprise us. Each answer raises new questions. Each discovery reveals how much remains to be discovered. Ancient Egypt is not a closed book that we have finished reading, but an ongoing story that continues to unfold as new evidence emerges and new analytical techniques become available. The enduring fascination with ancient Egypt reflects something deeper than simple historical curiosity. There is something about this civilization that captures the imagination in ways that other ancient cultures, however sophisticated or important, do not quite match. Perhaps it is the monumental scale of their achievements, the pyramids and temples that continue to dominate the landscape after thousands of years. Perhaps it is the vivid imagery of their art, colorful and detailed and surprisingly accessible despite the vast chronological distance. Perhaps it is the mystery and romance of tombs filled with treasure, of mummies and curses, of lost knowledge and hidden chambers. Or perhaps it is the sense that the ancient Egyptians achieved something extraordinary, that they created a civilization of remarkable stability and sophistication that lasted far longer than our own civilization has yet existed, and that they did so with a worldview and value system fundamentally different from our own. The differences between ancient Egyptian and modern Western civilization are profound. We value change, progress, and innovation. They valued stability, continuity, and tradition. We separate religion from government, the sacred from the secular. They saw all aspects of life as interconnected in a web of divine meaning and cosmic significance. We are individualistic, emphasizing personal autonomy and self-expression. They were communal, understanding individuals primarily in terms of their roles and relationships within larger social structures. We focus on this life, on material success and earthly happiness. They focused on the afterlife, understanding earthly existence as preparation for eternity. Neither worldview is simply right or wrong, but they represent fundamentally different ways of organizing human society and finding meaning in existence. What ancient Egypt demonstrates is that human civilizations can take radically different forms while still achieving remarkable sophistication and longevity. There is no single path that all societies must follow, no inevitable progression from simple to complex, from religious to secular, from traditional to modern. The Egyptians created a civilization that worked, that supported millions of people for thousands of years, that produced art and architecture and literature of enduring power, and that did so while maintaining values and beliefs that many modern people would find strange or incomprehensible. This should give us humility about our own assumptions and certainties. The modern world prides itself on being advanced, rational, and progressive, yet our civilization is quite young and has yet to demonstrate the kind of multi-millennial stability that Egypt achieved. Perhaps we have something to learn from a culture that managed to maintain social cohesion and cultural continuity over such vast stretches of time. The environmental engineering achievements of the ancient Egyptians deserve particular recognition in an era of climate change and environmental crisis. They transformed a narrow ribbon of potentially habitable land along the Nile into one of the most productive agricultural regions of the ancient world. They did this not by exploiting resources unsustainably, but by working with natural cycles, managing water carefully, and maintaining soil fertility through centuries of continuous cultivation. The annual flood brought not just water but also fresh silt that renewed the soil's productivity without requiring artificial fertilizers. The Egyptians managed this system through collective labor and centralized coordination, accepting the need for social discipline and governmental authority in exchange for the benefits of reliable food production. When the system worked, it supported a large population with a high standard of living and generated enough surplus to fund monumental construction and support specialized craftsmen and artists. When it failed, as during periods of low floods or political disorder, the consequences were catastrophic famines that could kill thousands and bring down governments. Modern development has disrupted this ancient system. The construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 20th century controlled the Nile floods, allowing for year-round irrigation and protecting against catastrophic high floods. But it also stopped the deposition of fresh silt, requiring the use of artificial fertilizers that have environmental costs. It has altered the ecology of the Nile Delta, causing coastal erosion and affecting fisheries. The trade-offs illustrate the complexity of environmental engineering and the difficulty of improving on systems that evolved over millennia to work in harmony with local conditions. The ancient Egyptians could not control the Nile's floods, but they understood how to work with them, how to prepare for variation, and how to build a civilization that could endure despite the uncertainties of the annual inundation. Our modern technology gives us greater control but perhaps less resilience, less ability to adapt to disruptions and unexpected changes. The writing systems of ancient Egypt represent another area of extraordinary achievement. Hieroglyphics are justly famous for their beauty, but they were also sophisticated in their linguistic structure. The system combined logograms representing whole words or concepts with phonetic signs representing sounds, allowing for flexibility and precision in expression. The same text could be written in formal hieroglyphics carved in stone, in hieratic cursive script written on papyrus for daily business, or in demotic, an even more simplified script used in later periods. This represents a level of literacy and textual culture that many other ancient civilizations never achieved. Scribes were trained professionals who spent years mastering the complex writing systems, and literacy was a pathway to social advancement and governmental careers. The Egyptian love of documentation meant that everything from religious texts to tax records to love letters was written down, creating an archive of information about ancient life that is unmatched in richness and detail. The preservation of this textual record owes much to Egypt's climate. Papyrus is an organic material that would normally decay quickly, but in Egypt's dry desert conditions, papyri have survived for thousands of years, brittle and fragile but still readable. The same dry climate has preserved organic materials that would perish elsewhere: wood, leather, textiles, even food offerings placed in tombs. This preservation creates a biased historical record, since we know far more about Egypt than about other ancient civilizations that did not benefit from such favorable preservation conditions. But it also provides an unparalleled window into ancient life, allowing us to read the actual words written by people thousands of years ago, to see the clothes they wore and the food they ate, to examine their tools and household goods in extraordinary detail. Every excavation in Egypt has the potential to produce not just stone monuments, but also organic materials that provide intimate glimpses into daily life in ways that excavations in wetter climates cannot match. The continuing discoveries in Egypt demonstrate that even after 2 centuries of intensive archaeological exploration, the civilization still has secrets to reveal. In recent years, archaeologists have discovered new tombs in the Valley of the Kings, found previously unknown chambers in the Great Pyramid, excavated entire cities that had been lost beneath the sand, and identified royal mummies that had been misidentified for decades. Each discovery makes headlines around the world, proof of the enduring public fascination with ancient Egypt. The Egyptian government has invested heavily in archaeology and tourism infrastructure, recognizing that the ancient monuments are not just cultural treasures, but also economic resources that draw millions of visitors annually. New museums, including the Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, provide state-of-the-art facilities for displaying and preserving artifacts. International teams of archaeologists work throughout Egypt in collaboration with Egyptian colleagues, combining expertise and resources to advance our understanding of this ancient civilization. Yet archaeology in Egypt faces significant challenges. The sheer number of sites and monuments exceeds the available resources for excavation and preservation. Many important sites remain unexcavated, waiting for funding and expertise that may not arrive for decades. Climate change threatens monuments through increased humidity, rising groundwater, and more frequent extreme weather events. Urban growth encroaches on archaeological sites, with modern Cairo expanding into areas that contain ancient remains. Tourism, while economically vital, also damages fragile monuments through the wear of millions of footsteps, the humidity from countless breaths, and occasional vandalism. Balancing preservation with access, research with tourism, and Egyptian cultural heritage with international scholarly interest requires careful navigation of complex and sometimes competing interests. The question of who owns the past remains contentious. Many of Egypt's greatest treasures reside in foreign museums, acquired during the colonial period through purchase, excavation, or outright theft. Egypt has requested the return of important artifacts, most notably the Rosetta Stone from the British Museum and the bust of Nefertiti from the News Museum in Berlin. The museums argue that they preserve these objects for all humanity and make them accessible to global audiences who could not easily travel to Egypt. Egyptian authorities argue that these artifacts are part of Egypt's national heritage and should be displayed in their original context. Both sides make valid points and no easy resolution exists. The broader question of cultural heritage and who has the right to possess, study, and display artifacts from ancient civilizations remains unresolved and continues to generate heated debate in museums and governments worldwide. Ancient Egypt's influence on later civilizations extends far beyond archaeology and museum collections. The Greeks and Romans admired Egyptian civilization and borrowed from it extensively, incorporating Egyptian gods into their pantheons, importing Egyptian obelisks to adorn their cities, and studying what they believed to be Egyptian wisdom and philosophy. This admiration was sometimes based on misunderstanding, as later civilizations projected their own ideas onto the mysterious monuments and created myths about Egyptian knowledge that had little basis in reality. The Renaissance saw a revival of interest in things Egyptian, with obelisks and pyramid forms appearing in European architecture and art. The Enlightenment fascination with reason and knowledge led to romanticized ideas about Egyptian wisdom and secret teachings. The 19th century discovery and decipherment of hieroglyphics sparked Egyptomania, with Egyptian motifs appearing in everything from architecture to furniture to fashion. This cultural influence continues into the present. Popular culture remains fascinated by ancient Egypt, with movies, novels, and video games regularly featuring pharaohs, pyramids, and mummies. The imagery is instantly recognizable: the distinctive artistic style, the hieroglyphics, the iconic monuments. Ancient Egypt has become a universal cultural reference point, part of the shared vocabulary of global civilization. Yet this popularization often bears little relationship to historical reality. Movie mummies rise from the dead to wreak vengeance. Novels feature cursed tombs and ancient conspiracies. Video games treat Egyptian mythology as a source of magic spells and supernatural powers. These fictional representations shape public understanding of ancient Egypt, often overwhelming the more nuanced and complex picture that emerges from serious scholarship. Educators and scholars face the constant challenge of correcting misconceptions and replacing fantasy with evidence-based knowledge, a task made more difficult by the fact that the fantasies are often more entertaining than the reality. Yet the reality of ancient Egypt, properly understood, is in its own way more remarkable than the fiction. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years, longer than the span from ancient Rome to the present day. A society that built monuments so massive and precise that we still struggle to understand how they were constructed. An artistic tradition so distinctive and powerful that its products remain instantly recognizable after 5,000 years. A religious and philosophical system that grappled with fundamental questions about life, death, justice, and cosmic order, producing insights that still resonate. A culture that valued beauty, wisdom, and order, that saw the divine in every aspect of existence, and that devoted enormous resources to ensuring that life would continue beyond death. These achievements represent the heights of what human civilization can accomplish when society is organized around shared values and collective purpose. The study of ancient Egypt also provides perspective on our own civilization and its achievements. We pride ourselves on technological advancement, and indeed modern technology gives us capabilities that the Egyptians could not have imagined. Yet in some respects they achieved things we have not. No modern state has maintained stable institutions and cultural continuity for 3,000 years. No contemporary architecture seems likely to survive for 5,000 years as the pyramids have. We have lost skills that the Egyptians possessed, from techniques of stoneworking to methods of pigment production to approaches to community organization and collective labor. Our individualistic, innovation-focused culture produces rapid change, but also instability and a sense of rootlessness. The Egyptian emphasis on tradition and continuity seems stifling from our perspective, but it produced a civilization of extraordinary longevity and resilience. Neither approach is simply superior, but comparing them reveals the trade-offs inherent in different ways of organizing human society. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, facing challenges from climate change to political instability to questions about the sustainability of our technological civilization, ancient Egypt offers both warnings and inspiration. The warnings come from studying the periods when Egyptian civilization faltered and failed, when weak governments could not maintain the irrigation systems, when foreign invasions disrupted trade and administration, when climate shifts reduced the Nile floods and brought famine. These collapses demonstrate the fragility of complex civilizations and their dependence on favorable conditions and effective governance. The inspiration comes from recognizing that humans have built sophisticated, enduring civilizations before, that collective action and long-term thinking can produce remarkable achievements, and that cultures very different from our own have succeeded in creating meaning, beauty, and prosperity for their people across vast stretches of time. The mysteries that remain in ancient Egypt are part of its enduring appeal. We will probably never know exactly how the pyramids were built, though we continue to develop increasingly sophisticated theories. We may never fully understand the religious experiences and spiritual insights of the ancient Egyptians, though we can read their texts and examine their practices. New discoveries will continue to surprise us, revealing aspects of this civilization that we had not suspected. The big void in the Great Pyramid may eventually be explored, potentially revealing treasures or information that will transform our understanding, or it may prove to be an empty space with no particular significance. New tombs will be discovered, new artifacts will be excavated, new techniques will be applied to old problems, and our picture of ancient Egypt will continue to evolve and develop. What seems certain is that ancient Egypt will continue to fascinate humanity for as long as our civilization endures. The monuments are too impressive to ignore, the achievements too remarkable to dismiss, and the questions too intriguing to abandon. Each generation brings its own concerns and perspectives to the study of Egypt, finding in this ancient civilization reflections of its own hopes and fears. The Victorians saw moral lessons and divine providence. The 20th century focused on economic systems and social structures. The 21st century brings questions about environmental sustainability and cultural diversity. Ancient Egypt is flexible enough to speak to all these concerns, rich enough to support multiple interpretations, and complex enough to resist any simple or final understanding. In the end, ancient Egypt reminds us that human beings have always grappled with fundamental questions about life, death, meaning, and how to organize society. The answers the Egyptians developed were specific to their time, place, and circumstances, yet they addressed universal human concerns that remain relevant today. How do we create stable, prosperous societies? How do we find meaning in a universe that often seems indifferent to human existence? How do we preserve knowledge and culture across generations? How do we balance individual needs with collective welfare? How do we face the inevitability of death and the uncertainty of what comes after? The ancient Egyptians spent 3,000 years developing their answers to these questions, leaving behind monuments, texts, and artifacts that allow us to study their solutions. We may not adopt their specific answers, but wrestling with the same questions in our own context connects us to this ancient civilization across the vast gulf of time that separates us. In studying ancient Egypt, we study ourselves, our potential, our limitations, and the enduring human quest for meaning, beauty, and transcendence in a world that is at once marvelous and mysterious. The legacy of the pharaohs endures not in political power or territorial control, but in the monuments that still stand, the texts that can still be read, the art that still moves us, and the questions that still intrigue us. Ancient Egypt is a paused civilization. Its active life ended more than 2 millennia ago, yet it lives on in our imaginations, our scholarship, and our culture. The pyramids still dominate the Giza Plateau, the temples still line the Nile, the tombs still hold their secrets, and the mummies still rest in museums and tombs, silent witnesses to a civilization that achieved greatness on its own terms and left an indelible mark on human history.